Hello, guys. Welcome to Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African. I'm Philip S.I.K.A. Before I start today's episode, let me invite you to click on the subscribe button and to also activate the ring bell so that you don't miss out on the latest episode. Your brother is getting married. You are applying for a job position abroad, or you would like to go on honeymoon with your partner as a newlywed. Let me ask you a question. How easy will this be for you to travel from country to country based on any purpose for traveling? For some of us, this question may be very trivial because some of us may be afforded the privilege to actually go from place A to place B, without having the burden of applying for a visa. But for also some of us, this question is very funny because we've already found ourselves in situations where it was not as easy as to just, pack your stuff, book your ticket, and then travel to the destination of your dream. In this episode, I'm going to talk about passport strength. I'm going to look at the current criterion around passport strength, and I'm also going to look at why some countries enjoy more privilege in terms of international mobility versus other countries, especially African countries. And if you stay tuned, I'm also going to tell you the top 5 or the most powerful African passport in 2023. Well, what is a passport actually? Like, this may be a very trivial question again, but some of us can, have a vague idea of a passport. Like, your passport is very different from your national ID. Your national ID is strictly for identification purpose. Your passport is also strictly for identification purpose, but the small nuance here is that your passport is the only administrative document that you can actually use in order to be able to fly out your country. If you are to book a flight, you cannot use your national ID or your retirement ID or your license, your driving license. It's impossible. You can only use your passport. So that is actually the first key element of your passport. It is meant to help you be able to fly or to travel outside your country exclusively and specifically. So what about the concept of passport strength? As you can imagine, your passport is not an individual. Your passport is not a person. So when I say passport strength, it does not mean your passport is strong enough to actually knock out, anybody on his way. I'm joking, But what I mean by passport strength is merely how much, freedom of mobility can you gain using your passport. In other terms, how many countries can you visit without having to apply for a visa? And this is very important, especially from an economic perspective. Like I said in the introduction, if you have to attend to a wedding, like, how likely is it for you, or will it be for you, to just catch the first flight and go to that wedding? If you have a business opportunity, if you have an education opportunity, if you have a health emergency, like, how likely will this be for you to, leave your current country to actually go to a better country to be afforded like better treatment or better access to, you know, opportunities? These are very important questions because sometimes traveling is not just a matter of enjoyment or a matter of leisure, but there's also a strong economic, link with being afforded, some kind of right and some kind of privilege to move from country to country. So coming back to my analysis, let's have a look at the various criterion, around a passport strength. Well, there are actually few criterion, but I'm only going to discuss one, which is the mobility aspect. So, like I said, a passport is considered strong based on how many access does it give you to countries across the world without necessarily having to apply for a visa. And in that category, according to the Henley Passport Index, in 2023, the most powerful of all, the most powerful passport in the world, is the passport from Singapore. Singapore passport gives you access to over 190 countries. Yes, 190. So if you have a Singapore passport, you can actually move freely, and travel visa free to 190 destinations in the world. And this is very interesting because overall there are only 227 countries in the world. So imagine as a Singapore passport holder being able to travel the world without the burden of applying for a visa. It means that whenever you are presented with a job opportunity, a business opportunity, if you have to attend a family event in almost anywhere in the world, you can actually go easily without, stressing about whether or not you have to apply 1 month or 2 weeks or 3 months, before the due date. Another powerful passport is the one from EU countries. Like most of the EU countries also enjoys a very, high privilege in terms of global mobility. If you're holding a passport from an EU country, you can also visit over 180 countries. This is very interesting. Then the critical question: how many countries in the world can you visit as an African citizen? I'm going to give you 1 second. Just give me a number. The first one that pops up in your mind, just write it down on the comment section, please. Well, I'm going to answer this question, in the next episode, so please stay tuned. But what I want us to keep in mind is to try and understand, first of all, why is there such a big difference between developed countries and emerging markets in terms of global mobility based on passport strength? Well, there are many criteria based on political stability, based on like macroeconomic criteria, etc. But in my opinion, the key element, that helps us understand and explain the big difference between African, passport holder versus developed economies passport holder is the economic performance. We need to understand that right now, when we're looking at the global GDP, developed countries and developed economies contribute over 50% of the global GDP. When we take a look at the global contribution of the African continent, this is very, small and minor compared to what developed economies, are producing. You also take a look at the GDP per capita. GDP per capita simply means the GDP per inhabitant, or per individual or per person. And mostly developed economies ranks like higher because they are actually able to have an index that is around or sometimes over $10,000 per individual. While in Africa, you'll notice that many of our countries, can barely reach, that cap. You can also consider like the global contribution in terms of global trade. Unfortunately, African economies are not as competitive as developed economies. So when taking in consideration all these elements, they can actually help understand and explain why is there such a huge gap between developed countries, passport holders versus African citizens when it comes to global mobility. So now the question that I want to ask us is, do we think that this is acceptable? Do we think that this is normal? Let me give you another very interesting perspective. In the current situation, in the current context, when we all know that economically speaking and commercially speaking, Africa lags behind developed economies. Okay, so wouldn't it be more rational and more logical for African citizens to be afforded the same mobility privilege in order for them to access better opportunities in terms of access to education, access to technology, access to health, access to training, in order to acquire all the necessary skills, to return in Africa and develop the continent? What do you think of this analysis? The second scenario here is, given the current context, we are in a situation where the system has created, condition where it is only okay for people, coming from developed areas to actually travel easily and freely into emerging and developing markets based solely on the reasoning that they can become investors, locally and try boost, and stimulate local and regional economy. Well, this argument may actually make sense, but I am very interested, in your opinion, on this topic. So let me know what's your take on this. Thank you for listening to S.I.K.A Talks, the podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.